Claire Bennett had been working as a doctor for 15 long years, and she thought she had seen everything that could happen in a hospital, but nothing prepared her for what happened that Tuesday evening when a bright purple light suddenly appeared in the middle of the emergency room and tore open like someone had ripped a hole in reality itself. Through the glowing portal came beings that looked like they belonged in fairy tales and not in a modern hospital, and they were tall and elegant, with pointed ears and silver hair that seemed to shine with its own light, and their eyes held wisdom that made Claire feel very small and young, even though she was 40 years old. The leader of these strange visitors stepped forward, and his voice filled the entire room when he spoke, and he said that they needed a healer who was skilled at fixing broken bodies and helping wounded spirits. And before Claire could say anything or ask any questions, she felt invisible hands pulling her toward the portal, and then everything went dark for just a moment. When Claire opened her eyes again, she found herself standing in a world that was completely impossible, and there were towers made of crystal that reached up toward 3 moons hanging in the sky, and dragons with wings wider than airplanes flew through clouds that were colored purple and gold. And everywhere she looked, there were more of the elegant alien people moving with grace that no human could ever match. The aliens called themselves the Sylvani, and they brought Claire to a palace that seemed to be made from living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light, and the hallways breathed like they were alive. And Claire kept touching the walls to make sure this was all real and not some strange dream caused by too much coffee during her night shift. King Theron met her in a throne room that was bigger than any building Claire had ever seen before, and the king was ancient, and his eyes held the weight of thousands of years of memories, and he looked at Claire with an expression that mixed hope with deep worry, and he told her why they had brought her to this alien world. His daughter, Princess Lyra, had been wounded in a battle against their enemies, and while the physical wounds would heal, the king was more worried about her spirit, because Lyra had always been wild and rebellious, and now she was taking terrible risks with her life and her dragon, and throwing herself into dangerous situations as if she wanted to die. The king led Claire through more corridors that glowed with strange light until they reached a massive chamber that had a ceiling so high Claire could barely see it. And there in the middle of the room sat a young woman with hair as black as midnight and eyes that burned with angry fire, and next to her was the most magnificent creature Claire had ever seen. The dragon was huge, with scales the color of deep red rubies, and eyes like melted gold. And when the dragon breathed, the air itself seemed to shimmer with heat, and Claire felt her heart beating faster because this was real, and dragons were real, and magic was real, and everything she thought she knew about the universe was wrong. The young woman looked at Claire, with disgust clear on her face, and she said she did not need some primitive human healer, and especially not someone from a world that had not even learned how to travel between stars, and her voice dripped with contempt that made Claire want to turn around and demand to go home. The dragon, whose name Claire learned was Ember, made a low growling sound that shook the floor beneath their feet, and smoke curled from her nostrils, and it was clear that both rider and dragon thought Claire was a waste of their time. But Claire had dealt with difficult patients before, including gang members and soldiers and terrified children, and she knew how to see past anger to find the fear underneath. And she looked carefully at both Lyra and Ember, and she saw things that made her doctor instincts kick in immediately. There was a deep wound along Ember's wing, and the membrane was torn, and the edges of the wound looked infected and showed signs of spreading corruption, and Lyra was holding her left side in a way that meant she had broken ribs and possibly internal bleeding. And most importantly, Claire saw the desperate love between the rider and her dragon, and the terror that neither would ever admit to feeling. Claire set down her medical kit and looked Lyra straight in the eyes and told her that she was being a fool, because that wound was going to kill her dragon in about 3 days if it was not treated properly, and judging by the way Lyra was breathing, she had at least 2 cracked ribs and maybe worse injuries inside her body. For the first time since Claire had arrived, the mask of anger on Lyra's face cracked just a little bit, and Ember lowered her massive head and studied Claire with intelligent eyes that seemed to look right into her soul. Then Claire heard a voice inside her head, and it was not her own thoughts, but someone else speaking directly into her mind. And it was Ember asking if Claire would really help them, even after they had been so rude and unwelcoming. Claire took a deep breath and said that she was a doctor and helping people was what she did, And it did not matter if those people were human or alien or even dragons, because a patient was a patient, and everyone deserved care that night. Claire began the long process of cleaning and treating Ember's wound. And it was difficult work, because dragon scales were much tougher than human skin, and the infection was unlike anything in Earth's medical books. And Lyra watched with eyes that slowly changed from hostile to cautiously interested. As Claire worked, she explained everything she was doing and why, and she talked about human medicine and how she had learned to adapt to unusual situations. And Lyra asked questions that showed she was much smarter than her angry attitude suggested. By the time Claire finished the first treatment and wrapped clean bandages around Ember's wing, the sun was starting to rise and paint the sky with colors that Earth never had, and Claire was exhausted, but she felt something she had not felt in years, and it was the feeling of being exactly where she was supposed to be. Lyra stood up slowly and winced from her broken ribs, and she looked at Claire with an expression that was hard to read, and then she said something that surprised both of them, and she thanked Claire in a quiet voice that held no more contempt. Claire smiled and told Lyra that tomorrow they would start treating her injuries too, and Lyra tried to argue, but Claire just raised one eyebrow in a look that had made countless stubborn patients back down over the years, and even a rebellious alien princess recognized when she had met her matches. Claire followed a servant to her guest chambers. She had no idea that she had just taken the first step into a war that would span entire star systems, and she did not know that the angry princess and her fierce dragon would become more important to her than anything she had left behind on Earth. But somewhere, deep in her heart, Claire felt the beginning of something new, and it was the feeling of family and home and belonging, and those were things she had been searching for her entire life without even knowing it. The next 3 weeks tested every bit of patience and skill that Claire had gained from her 15 years as a doctor, and Lyra turned out to be the most difficult patient she had ever encountered in her entire career, and the princess was stubborn and dismissive and constantly tried to sneak Ember out for flights even though the dragon's wing was still healing. Claire caught them twice trying to leave through the palace's eastern tower, and once she found Lyra actually climbing onto Ember's back in the middle of the night, and Claire had to physically stand in front of the dragon and refuse to move until Lyra agreed to come back inside. But Claire had dealt with difficult patients before, and she had one big advantage over everyone else in the palace, and that advantage was simple, because she genuinely cared about both Lyra and Ember, and she was not afraid to tell them the truth even when that truth made them angry. One evening, while Claire was changing the bandages on Ember's wing, she mentioned that humans had a saying about leading horses to water, but not being able to make them drink, and Lyra scoffed from her usual spot near the window and said they were not horses but warriors. Claire looked up from her work, and her voice was sharp when she told Lyra that warriors who kept being stupid would die young and leave nothing behind except regrets. And she asked Lyra directly if the infection in Ember's wing had come from a void swarm weapon. The question made Lyra go very still, and Claire continued talking and said she had spent many hours in the royal library reading everything she could find about the enemy, and the void swarm was a collective of biomechanical horrors that consumed entire worlds, and they had been at war with the Sylvani people for 3 generations. The swarm had recently started targeting dragons specifically because dragons were the only weapons that could effectively fight against swarm ground forces, and the swarm weapons were designed to kill dragons slowly and painfully over days and weeks. Lyra's expression grew dark and sad, and she admitted that yes, it had been a swarm weapon, and she and Ember had destroyed the nest that attacked their patrol, but Claire had heard the reports from other members of Lyra's squadron, and she knew the real story. Claire told Lyra that she knew the princess had charged in alone without any backup against enemies that outnumbered her 50 to 1, and she said that Lyra's father was not trying to cage her or control her, but was simply terrified of losing his only daughter. Lyra's voice dropped to a whisper, and for the first time since they met, Claire heard the pain underneath all that anger. And Lyra said her father did not understand anything, and that every day more of their people died and more worlds fell to the swarm, and she had the power to make a difference. But her father wanted her to sit safely in the palace while others fought and died. Ember raised her massive head and nuzzled her rider gently and spoke into both their minds and said that the humans spoke wisdom, and that they could not save their people if they were dead. And Claire smiled and said that even the dragon was smarter than the princess. Then Claire softened her tone and said she understood because she had spent years working in war zones on Earth, and she had patched up soldiers who thought they were invincible, and the ones who survived were not the fearless ones, but the smart ones who learned to balance courage with wisdom. Something shifted in Lyra's eyes, and for the first time she really looked at Claire and saw not just an inconvenient human, but someone who might actually understand what she was going through. And Lyra asked Claire to tell her about human wars. So Claire talked about the conflicts on Earth and about the soldiers she had saved and the ones she could not save. And she spoke about fear and bravery, and about the thin line between heroism and suicide. And as she spoke, Lyra began to open up too. Lyra talked about the crushing weight of being a princess during wartime and about having power but no freedom, and about loving a father who treated her like fragile glass instead of strong. Steele and Claire listened without judgment and asked questions that showed she was really paying attention. By the time Ember's wing had healed enough for short practice flights, something fundamental had changed between the three of them, and Lyra no longer tried to dismiss Claire's advice, and instead she asked questions about human medicine, and about warfare, and about how Claire stayed strong when surrounded by death and suffering. One evening they sat together watching Ember practice gentle glides in the palace courtyard, and Lyra admitted that Claire was not what she had expected. And when her father said he was bringing a human healer, Lyra had imagined someone weak and soft. Claire laughed and said she had performed surgery and bombed hospitals with the ceiling collapsing around her, and she had held soldiers together with nothing but pressure and desperate prayers. And humans might not have Sylvani magic or their long lifespans, but humans were survivors above all else. Lyra studied Claire with newfound respect and said there were stories about species like humans, and the Sylvani called it humanity for yes, and it meant species who refused to quit, and who adapted to anything, and who turned their very mortality into a kind of strength. Claire asked if that was why King Theron had brought her here, and if it was because humans were stubborn. And Lyra smiled for the first time since they met, and said perhaps it was that. Or perhaps it was because Claire was the only healer in any realm who would tell a princess she was being an idiot. They both laughed, and in that moment of shared humor, Claire realized that the rebellious princess had become something unexpected and precious, and Lyra had become a friend. Over the following days, Claire noticed that Lyra was changing in small but important ways, and the princess still had fire in her eyes, but now she thought before acting, and she listened to advice even when she did not like it, and she started talking to her father without shouting. Claire also noticed that King Theron was changing too, and he started asking Lyra for her opinions on military strategy, and he listened when she spoke, instead of just giving orders, and the tension between father and daughter began to ease like a wound finally starting to heal. But peace never lasted long in a world at war, and one night the palace emergency alarm started blaring with a sound that made Claire's heart race with fear, and she ran toward the war room where she had been given access after proving her value to the kingdom. What she found in the war room made her blood turn cold, and holographic displays showed sections of border worlds going dark one after another. And this was not a typical swarm attack, but something new and terrifying. The swarm had changed their tactics completely, and instead of overwhelming the Sylvani with massive numbers, they were using precision strikes and surgical attacks that targeted dragon roosts specifically, and the attacks were coordinated and calculated in ways the swarm had never shown before. General Kalen, who commanded the Sylvani military forces, looked grim, and his silver hair seemed to bristle with barely controlled fury, and he reported that 17 dragons were confirmed dead, and 23 were critically injured, and he turned to Claire with serious eyes. The general said the wounds were unlike anything they had seen before, and it was as if the swarm had studied dragon biology and designed weapons specifically to cause maximum suffering. And Claire felt sick because she knew what that meant. Before anyone could say more, Lyra burst into the war room with Ember's presence filling her mind, and she announced that she was taking her squadron to the border worlds immediately because they could still save the wounded dragons. King Theron's voice cracked like thunder when he said no, and that he would not send his daughter into an obvious trap, and Lyra's eyes blazed with anger. And she demanded to know how he could call it a trap when their people were dying. Claire stepped between father and daughter, and her mind was already racing through possibilities. And she asked, what if it really was a trap? And she told them to think about it because the swarm knew how Lyra would respond, and they knew she would charge in to save wounded dragons. The room fell completely silent, and Lyra stared at Claire as if she had been slapped, and General Kalen admitted grudgingly that the human was right, and their scouts had reported unusual swarm formations around each attack site, as if they were waiting for something specific. Claire studied the tactical displays and saw a pattern that reminded her of military strategies from Earth, and she said the swarm was not just waiting for riders but was studying them, and every attack was gathering data on how Sylvani forces responded, and how dragons fought, and how quickly reinforcements arrived. She explained that on Earth this was called reconnaissance in force, and you attacked not to win but to learn. And the swarm was not trying to conquer these worlds but was running experiments, and that meant the real attack was still coming. Lyra's hand clenched into a fist, and she said, then they needed to stop giving the swarm data, and they needed to change their tactics entirely. And King Theron looked at his daughter with new consideration and asked what she proposed. For the next hour, they worked together to create a plan that combined Sylvani military knowledge with human guerrilla tactics, and instead of charging in with overwhelming dragon power, they would use stealth and small teams and hit-and-run strikes. Claire announced she would go with the rescue teams because if these weapons were designed specifically for dragons, she needed to see them. The border world called Silver Peak was dying, and as Ember descended through smoke-filled skies, Claire could see the devastation spreading across the landscape below, and forests had been burned down to nothing but ash, and the dragon roost was reduced to shattered pieces of crystal, and everywhere she looked there were signs of void swarm occupation. Black biomechanical structures grew across the land like cancerous tumors, and they pulsed with sickly green light that made Claire feel ill just looking at them, and the air itself smelled wrong. Like burning metal mixed with something organic and rotten. Lyra pointed toward a cave system on the side of a mountain and said the survivors were hiding in old emergency shelters. But the swarm forces were also in that area, and Claire felt Ember's muscles tense beneath her as the dragon prepared for whatever might come. Claire had been shocked by how comfortable she had become riding a dragon in just a few weeks. But perhaps it was simply that Ember had decided to accept her fully, and the dragon's scales were warm despite the cold altitude, and her flight was surprisingly smooth, even through the turbulent, smoky air. Behind them, the rest of the squadron spread out in the formation. They had practiced endlessly over the past 2 days, and it was not the traditional Sylvani massed attack where dragons flew together in tight groups, but something new and different and human in its approach. Small units working independently and ready to adapt to changing situations. And Claire called through the communication crystal that they were not here to fight, but to extract the wounded and gather intelligence, and then get out before the swarm could coordinate a response. The landing was tense, and Ember touched down in a clearing, while Lyra's squadron mates created a defensive perimeter around them, and Claire immediately ran toward the cave entrance where wounded dragons and their riders had taken shelter. What she found inside. The cave made her want to scream with rage and horror, and 5 dragons lay in various states of agony, and the wounds were hideous, and not clean cuts, but corrupted tissue that seemed to be spreading and consuming healthy scales and flesh. The dragons' mental voices were a chorus of pain that echoed inside Claire's head and made Ember roar in sympathetic rage, and the sound shook dust from the cave ceiling, and Lyra asked if Claire could help them, and her voice was tight with barely controlled emotion. Claire knelt beside the nearest dragon, who was a young bronze-colored one named Spark, and the wound across his flank was spreading like an infection. But it was not biological, and it was something else entirely. And the tissue was not just dying but being transformed into something that looked like swarm biomass. Her mind raced through everything she knew about medicine and biology, and this was beyond normal treatment because this was weaponized corruption. But if she could understand how it worked, then maybe she could find a way to stop it or at least slow it down. She told Lyra she needed samples and that she needed to talk to the riders about their dragons, and she asked how long after the initial injury did this spreading, corruption begin. And for the next hour, Claire worked with desperate focus. She took tissue samples and blood samples and recorded detailed observations about each wound, and the pattern that emerged was absolutely chilling, and the swarm weapons injected microscopic machines that rewrote living tissue at the cellular level. It was brilliant and terrifying, and almost impossible to stop. And Claire muttered the word almost under her breath because she had noticed something important that the swarm had not counted on, and that was human adaptability in medical science. The nanomachines followed predictable patterns in how they spread and converted tissue, and patterns could be disrupted if you knew what to look for, and Claire called Lyra over and told her to find a case of broad-spectrum antivirals from Earth in her medical kit. She explained that the antivirals would not cure the corruption, but they might slow the spread long enough to get these dragons back to the palace medical facility where they could receive proper treatment. And as Lyra helped her administer the treatments, alarms suddenly blazed through their communication crystals. The squadron leader called out that swarm forces were converging on their position fast, and there were multiple biomechanical units approaching, and they were moving with terrifying coordination. And through the cave entrance, Claire could see them coming. They were nightmarish fusions of insect and machine, and they moved with purpose and intelligence that made her skin crawl. But there was something else at the center of the swarm formation that made her blood freeze in her veins. A large construct, bigger than all the others, was broadcasting something, and not sounds, but streams of data and information, and her communication crystal automatically translated the signals into words she could understand. The swarm's collective voice echoed through the crystal, and it said how interesting that the Sylvani had acquired a human, and how unexpected and how useful this would be for their research, and Claire felt her stomach drop. She breathed out that the swarm knew what she was, and Lyra's face went pale as she realized what this meant, and she said the swarm wanted Claire specifically, and this was not a trap for dragon riders, but a trap designed to capture the human. Suddenly everything made terrible sense, and the changed tactics, and the specific timing of attacks after Claire's arrival, and the focus on wounds that would require an expert healer. And the swarm had been watching and learning about this new variable. Now the collective intelligence wanted to capture and study the human who had disrupted its calculations. And Claire felt fear rising in her throat, but pushed it down because there were wounded dragons who needed her help. Lyra commanded her squadron to fall back to Extraction Point Alpha, and then she turned to Claire and asked if the wounded dragons could fly at all. And Claire said, not far, but maybe far enough if the squadron could buy them 5 minutes. Lyra's eyes blazed with that familiar defiant fire, but this time it was tempered with tactical thinking, and she said that Ember and she would buy Claire 10 minutes because she had an idea that her crazy human would probably call both stupid and brilliant at the same time. Before Claire could protest, Lyra was on Ember's back, and they were launching skyward, and the dragon's roar shook the entire mountain as she unleashed a torrent of flame across the swarm's advancing line. But this was not a suicidal charge like the old Lyra would have made, and instead it was a calculated provocation designed to draw attention, and the swarm's large construct turned all its sensors toward Ember exactly as Lyra had intended. While the construct focused on the valuable dragon rider, the rest of the squadron helped the wounded dragons escape through a secondary route that Claire had identified earlier, and it was working perfectly, until the swarm revealed it had been learning faster than anyone expected. Biomechanical flyers launched from hidden positions and cut off Ember's retreat path, and Claire watched in horror as they began to surround the princess and her dragon from all sides. And there were too many of them. Lyra and Ember fought with incredible skill and grace, and the dragon's fire turned swarm units into molten slag, but more kept coming, and they were being pushed back and corralled like prey. And Claire felt her heart pounding. She whispered no, and then louder she shouted no because she could not let this happen. And something crystallized in that moment with perfect clarity, and Lyra and Ember had not just become friends, but had become family. Claire had not spent her entire life running into burning buildings and war zones just to watch her family die, and she would not start now, and she grabbed a Sylvani plasma rifle from one of the injured riders. The rider protested that she could not fight the swarm, but Claire smiled grimly and said she was not going to fight them, but instead was going to give them exactly what they wanted and teach them why you did not mess with a human's family. She ran toward the battle, and her human lungs burned in the thin atmosphere, and her legs pumped with adrenaline-fueled strength. and above her Ember wheeled and dove with Lyra guiding her through a storm of swarm projectiles. The trap was closing tighter and more. Swarm units emerged from beneath the ground, and that massive central construct began pulsing with energy that made Claire's skin crawl with wrongness. Claire shouted that she was here, and she knew the swarm could hear through its units, and she yelled that if it wanted to study a human, then it should come study this, and she raised the plasma rifle. But she did not fire at the construct, and instead she fired at the crystalline deposits scattered around the battlefield. And Silver Peak was famous for its resonant crystals that the Sylvani used for communication technology. What the swarm probably did not know was that Claire had spent the past week reading everything she could about those crystals, including their explosive properties when subjected to certain energy frequencies. From plasma weapons, the first crystal detonated with a sound like reality itself tearing apart, and then the next one exploded, and then the next, and a chain reaction of explosions ripped through the swarm's formation. The explosions scattered their units and disrupted whatever coordination signal the central construct was broadcasting to control them. And in that moment of chaos, Ember dove like a crimson meteor. Lyra's hand stretched down, and Claire grabbed it and felt herself yanked upward, with strength that should have torn her arm from its socket, and she scrambled onto Ember's back behind Lyra. Claire spent the next week working day and night in the palace medical facility, studying the tissue samples she had collected from the wounded dragons, and what she discovered made her both excited and terrified at the same time. The swarm nanomachines were incredibly sophisticated, and they operated at a level that was far beyond anything human science had achieved. But they also had weaknesses, and Claire found that certain combinations of Earth medicines could slow down, or even stop the conversion process. She worked alongside Sylvani healers who had been practicing their craft for centuries, and together they developed a treatment protocol that combined human medical knowledge with Sylvani energy healing techniques, and the results were promising. 5 dragons they had rescued from Silver Peak were responding well to treatment, and the corruption in their wounds had stopped spreading, and new healthy tissue was slowly replacing the damaged areas, and Spark, the young bronze dragon, was already strong enough to take short flights. Claire was exhausted from the long hours, but she felt satisfaction knowing that her work was saving lives, and Lyra visited the medical facility every day, and sometimes she brought food that Claire had forgotten to eat, and sometimes she just sat quietly and kept Claire company. One evening, as Claire was reviewing her notes, Lyra asked her about Earth and what it was like to live on a world with only one moon, and Claire smiled and began telling stories about oceans and mountains and cities filled with millions of people. She talked about human culture and art and music and all the beautiful, messy, complicated things that made humanity unique, and Lyra listened with fascination and asked questions that showed she was genuinely interested in understanding where Claire came from. Ember would sometimes join these conversations, and her massive head would rest near them, while her mind touched theirs, and the dragon asked about human dragons, and whether Earth had legends of creatures like her. Claire explained that humans had myths and stories about dragons for thousands of years, and that in some cultures, dragons were seen as wise and noble beings, while in others, they were viewed as dangerous monsters, and Ember found this very amusing. The dragon said that perhaps humans had somehow sensed that dragons existed somewhere in the universe, and their myths were a kind of racial memory reaching across the stars, and Claire thought that was a beautiful idea even if it was not scientifically possible. But these peaceful moments could not last forever, and 3 weeks after the mission to Silver Peak, the emergency alarm sounded again, and this time, the threat was much worse than before. Claire ran to the war room and found it filled with tension and fear, and the holographic displays showed something that made her heart sink, and the swarm was launching a massive coordinated assault on multiple worlds simultaneously. General Kalen explained that this was the real attack they had been preparing for, and all those earlier strikes had been gathering data, and now the swarm was using everything it had learned to devastating effect. The swarm forces were targeting dragon breeding grounds and training facilities and supply depots, and they were using the exact tactics that would cause maximum damage while avoiding Sylvani strengths. King Theron looked older than Claire had ever seen him, and he was making rapid decisions about which worlds to defend and which ones would have to be abandoned, and every choice meant lives lost. Lyra stood beside her father, studying the tactical displays with intense concentration, and she pointed out patterns in the swarm attacks that others had missed, and she suggested defensive strategies that combined traditional Sylvani tactics with the new approaches they had developed. Claire noticed that father and daughter were now working together as a team, and there was no more arguing or tension between them, and instead there was mutual respect and trust, and it was beautiful to see even in the midst of crisis. But then something appeared on the displays that made everyone in the room go silent, and a new type of swarm construct had been detected, and it was massive and unlike anything they had encountered before. The construct was heading directly toward the Sylvani home world and toward the palace itself, and it was broadcasting the same kind of data signals that the construct on Silver Peak had used, and General Kalen said grimly that it was looking for something specific. Claire felt a cold certainty settle in her stomach, and she knew what the swarm wanted, and it wanted her, and the collective intelligence had become obsessed with understanding the human variable that kept disrupting its calculations. Lyra immediately said that they needed to evacuate Claire to a safe location far from the palace, but Claire shook her head and said that running would not solve anything because the swarm would just keep hunting her. She had a different idea, and it was dangerous and probably insane, but it might be their only chance to turn the swarm's obsession into a weakness they could exploit. Claire proposed that instead of hiding from the swarm construct, they should let it come, and they should prepare a trap that would use the construct's desire to capture her against itself. The room erupted in protests, and King Theron said absolutely not, and he would not allow Claire to be used as bait, and Lyra looked furious and said there had to be another way. But Claire stood her ground, and she explained that the swarm's greatest advantage was its ability to learn and adapt, but that was also its greatest weakness, because it was so focused on gathering data about her that it might miss other threats. She proposed using herself as bait to draw the construct into a kill zone where the full might of the Sylvani military could destroy it, and if they could eliminate this construct, they might learn valuable information about swarm biology and technology. General Kalen studied Claire with new respect and said the plan had merit, but the risk to Claire was unacceptable, and they could not sacrifice the human who had already given them so much. Claire smiled sadly and said she was not being noble or self-sacrificing, and she was being practical because the swarm would not stop hunting her, and eventually it would succeed unless they dealt with it directly. Lyra grabbed Claire's arm, and her voice was tight with emotion, and she said she had just found a sister, and she was not going to lose her to some biomechanical monster. The word sister hit Claire hard, and she had never had siblings on Earth, and she had always felt alone even when surrounded by people. But here on this alien world she had found family. She put her hand over Lyra's and said that was exactly why she had to do this, and because family protected each other. And right now, the best way to protect Lyra and Ember and everyone else was to end the swarm's obsession with capturing a human. The argument continued for another hour, but eventually Claire's logic won out, and they began planning the trap in detail, and it would require precise timing and coordination, and one mistake could result in disaster. They chose a location in the Crystal Valleys north of the palace, where the terrain would limit the construct's mobility, and they positioned dragon squadrons in hidden positions and set up energy weapons that could penetrate swarm armor. Claire would be in the center of the kill zone with a small guard force, and her job was to keep the construct focused on her long enough for the trap to close, and it sounded simple, but everyone knew how dangerous it would be. The night before the operation, Lyra insisted on staying with Claire, and they sat together in Claire's chambers, and for a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, Lyra said she was scared, and not for herself, but for Claire, and she said that losing Claire would be like losing part of her soul, and Ember agreed through their mental link. Claire felt tears in her eyes, and she said she was scared too, but she also felt certain this was the right thing to do, and she had spent her whole life helping people, and if this was how her story ended, then at least it would mean something. Lyra hugged her tightly and said it was not going to end, and they were going to win, and then they would celebrate, and Claire would tell her more stories about Earth. They spent the rest of the night talking about everything and nothing and making plans for the future that they both desperately wanted to believe in. And when dawn came, they were ready. The trap was set, and Claire stood in the center of the Crystal Valley wearing a communication device and holding a medical scanner that she had modified to broadcast human biological signatures. The swarm construct appeared on the horizon, and it was even larger than the reports had suggested, and it moved with terrible purpose, and its sensors were all focused on the small human standing alone in the valley. Claire's heart pounded, but her hands were steady, and she had faced death before in emergency rooms and war zones, and she knew how to push fear aside and focus on what needed to be done. The construct moved closer, and its biomechanical voice echoed across the valley, and it said that the human would be taken and studied and understood, and the collective would learn all her secrets. Claire spoke clearly into her communication device and said the swarm was welcome to try. And then she triggered the signal that would spring. The trap dragons erupted from hidden positions and filled the sky. With fire and fury, and energy weapons opened up from concealed emplacements and poured devastating force into the construct's armor. The construct screamed with a sound that was not entirely mechanical, and it tried to retreat. But the terrain blocked its escape routes, and Ember led the aerial assault with Lyra on her back. The weeks following the destruction of the swarm construct brought changes that rippled across the entire Sylvani kingdom, and the technology salvaged from the construct's remains gave their scientists new insights into how the swarm operated, and how it thought, and most importantly, how it could be defeated. Claire worked closely with the research teams, and her human perspective on biology and technology helped them understand things that Sylvani scientists had missed, and together they developed new weapons and defenses that were specifically designed to counter swarm tactics. But the most important change was not technological, and it was personal. And it was the way the Sylvani people had started to see humans differently, and they no longer viewed Earth as a primitive world, but as a place that produced warriors and healers who could stand alongside them. Claire received visitors from across the kingdom, and young Sylvani who wanted to learn human medicine and military, officers who wanted to study human tactical thinking, and even artists and philosophers who were fascinated by human culture. She found herself becoming not just a healer, but an ambassador and a bridge between two species who had so much to learn from each other, and it was exhausting and exhilarating and sometimes overwhelming. Through it all, Lyra and Ember remained by her side, and they had become inseparable, and the three of them spent almost every day together. And whether Claire was working in the medical facility or training new healers or helping plan defensive strategies, one evening as they sat together watching the three moons rise over the palace, Lyra said something that surprised Claire, and she said that she had been thinking about the future and about what would happen after the war eventually ended. Claire asked what she meant, and Lyra explained that she had always assumed she would follow the traditional path of a Sylvani princess, and eventually she would marry someone her father chose and produce heirs and live a life that was mapped out for her. But meeting Claire had changed everything, and Lyra said she had realized that she did not have to follow anyone else's path, and she could choose her own way, and her own family and her own future. Ember's voice joined their mental conversation, and the dragon said that she had known for a long time that Lyra was different from other Sylvani, and that her spirit burned too bright to be contained by tradition. Claire felt her heart swell with emotion, and she said that both of them had taught her the same lesson, and that she had spent her whole life moving from place to place and never really belonging anywhere, and always feeling like something was missing. But here with them she had found what was missing, and she had found home, and not a place but people who understood her and accepted her completely, and loved her for exactly who she was. Lyra reached out and took Claire's hand and said that was what family meant, and not blood or tradition, but choice and love, and the decision to stand together no matter what came. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Claire asked what Lyra wanted to do after the war, and the princess smiled and said she wanted to travel and to see other worlds and to learn about different species and cultures. She wanted Ember and Claire to come with her, and they would be explorers and ambassadors, and they would show the universe what was possible when different beings chose to work together instead of staying separate. Claire laughed and said that sounded perfect, and that she had always wanted to see more of the universe, and now she had the best possible traveling companions. But the peaceful moment was interrupted by urgent news from the border worlds, and General Kalen sent word that the swarm was launching another major offensive, and this time they were using new tactics that seemed designed to counter everything the Sylvani had learned. King Theron called an emergency council meeting, and Claire attended alongside Lyra, and the other military leaders, and what they learned was both impressive and terrifying. The swarm had adapted again, and it had learned from the loss of its construct, and now it was using smaller, more mobile units that were harder to track and trap, and it was avoiding direct confrontation with dragon squadrons. Instead, the swarm was targeting civilian populations and infrastructure and forcing the Sylvani to spread their forces thin, trying to protect everything at once. Lyra studied the tactical displays and pointed out that this was exactly the kind of strategy that humans had used throughout their history, and she said the swarm was learning, not just from Sylvani tactics but from human military history. Claire felt a chill run down her spine, and she realized that by studying her, the swarm had gained access to thousands of years of human warfare knowledge, and every conflict and every strategy that humanity had ever developed. General Kalen asked grimly if this meant they had made things worse by bringing a human into the war, and Claire shook her head and said no, because the swarm would have eventually learned these tactics anyway. What mattered now was that they needed to think even more creatively, and they needed to do things the swarm could not predict or understand. King Theron asked what she proposed, and Claire said they needed to stop thinking about this as a military problem and start thinking about it as a medical problem. She explained that the swarm was like a disease, and it spread and consumed and corrupted everything it touched, and you could not defeat a disease by just fighting the symptoms, and you had to attack the root cause. The swarm was a collective intelligence, and that meant all its units were connected, and they shared information constantly, and if they could disrupt that connection even temporarily, they could create chaos in the swarm's coordination. Lyra's eyes lit up with understanding, and she said the resonant crystals, and they could use the same principle that Claire had used on Silver Peak, but on a much larger scale. Over the next few hours, they developed a plan that was audacious and risky and required resources from across the entire kingdom, and they would create a massive resonant pulse that would disrupt swarm communications across multiple star systems. But to make it work, they needed to plant amplification, devices deep in swarm-controlled territory, and that meant volunteers would have to fly suicide missions into the heart of enemy space. Lyra immediately volunteered and said that she and Ember would lead the mission, and Claire started to protest, but Lyra cut her off and said this was what they had been training for. Claire said then she was coming too, and Lyra argued that it was too dangerous, but Claire reminded her that they were family, and family did not let each other face danger alone. King Theron listened to them argue, and then he held up his hand for silence, and he said that both of them were right, and that Lyra should lead the mission because she was the best tactical mind in the kingdom. But Claire should go too because they would need a healer, and because the human perspective might be crucial if they encountered unexpected situations. He looked at both of them with love and pride, and said he was terrified of losing them, but he was also honored to have such brave and brilliant people in his family. The mission launched 3 days later, and it was a fleet of 30 dragons carrying the best riders in the kingdom, and Claire flew with Lyra on Ember's back, and they carried one of the amplification devices. The journey into swarm territory was tense, and they flew through regions of space where entire worlds had been consumed and transformed into biomechanical nightmares, and Claire saw things that would haunt her dreams, but she also saw the courage of the Sylvani riders and the magnificent power of their dragons and the unbreakable bonds between them. And she understood why the swarm feared dragons so much. They reached the first installation point, and while other teams provided cover, Lyra and Claire worked together to plant the amplification device and calibrate it properly. And it was delicate work that required precision. Swarm units detected them and attacked, but Ember fought with fury that seemed to set the very air on fire, and other dragons joined the defense, and they held the position long enough to complete the installation. They repeated this process at 5 more locations, and each time the danger grew worse as the swarm learned what they were doing and concentrated more forces to stop them. At the final installation point, they were surrounded and outnumbered, and 3 dragons had already been lost, and Claire worked frantically to complete the calibration, while Lyra and Ember held off wave after wave of swarm units. Finally, the device was ready, and Claire activated it, and the resonant pulse began building, and she called to Lyra that they needed to leave immediately. But as they tried to escape, a massive swarm construct appeared and blocked their path, and it was similar to the one they had destroyed before, but larger and more heavily armored. Ember roared defiance and attacked, but the construct was ready, and it caught the dragon with a biomechanical tentacle and began pulling them down toward the corrupted planet. Surface below. Claire saw other dragons trying to help, but they were too far away and would not reach them in time, and she felt fear threatened to overwhelm her. But then she remembered something. The amplification device was building to critical levels, and in a few seconds it would discharge the resonant pulse that would disrupt all swarm communications in this sector. She grabbed the device's controller, and instead of waiting for the automatic discharge, she manually triggered it early, and the pulse erupted with devastating force.